third and final keynote presentation. My name is Nico Petesch. I'm also part of the research group, and together with Daniela Gretz and Markus Krause, I represent the Cologne section of that group. And I'm very glad that I get the opportunity to chair this very promising session. And I'm going to very briefly introduce Corinna Norrick-Rühl. I'm very glad that she agreed to do this keynote. Corinna and I have been in touch at the very start when we were still in the planning phase of the whole research group. So it's very good to have you here, actually here in an actual research group, not only in the planning phase. And so Corinna Norrick-Rühl is chair of book history at the Department of English at the University of Münster. Before that, she worked at the Department of Buchwissenschaft at the University of Mainz. And I think it's obvious already by the title of her talk that her research is immediately connected to the overall conference topic. She has worked on popular book series on the German book market, such as the famous Roh-Reihe, or we talked on the phone the other day, and she also did work on Pixie books, if I remember that right. Not everybody will know what Pixie books are, but it's definitely worth looking into. Reader's Digest is another topic, and all this research was summed up recently in a book that came out with Cambridge University Press, entitled Book Clubs and Book Commerce. And I believe that what we are going to hear and discuss now is in close vicinity to that research and to that publication. So welcome, Corinna, and we are looking forward to your talk on periodicity, timeliness, and the limits. Oh, sorry. Don't panic. You know why I made the mistake, but it's because it's also periodicity is the first word also, but the second word is subscription and mass circulation, mail order book culture reconsidered.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I did put a handout into the chat earlier. If people who came in later didn't see it, I'm happy to upload it again. If somebody can just see if they can scroll back. Ruth is nodding. No, she's not. She's shaking. Okay, I'll just upload it again. Just make sure. Sorry, there. Okay.
Yes, we see it.
Great. And I'm also going to try to share my screen. And I'll also be waving things at the camera, books and magazines, because I can't resist to have material objects with me. Yeah, thank you, Nico, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the whole team of the DFG Forschergruppe 2288 Journalliteratur for their invitation to speak at this fantastic event. Despite COVID-induced rescheduling restrictions, you've orchestrated an amazing conference. I'm delighted to be able to contribute to these discussions with my talk today. I'm also so pleased to share the virtual stage with brilliant colleagues from such a wide range of disciplines and perspectives, especially but not limited to Ruth and Will. Thank you to everyone who's here despite the heat and not at the pool. But Nico was saying before that maybe people are at the pool and are just listening in. So who knows? Welcome. I would also like to thank the Harry Ransom Center, Austin, for helping me go to Austin and spend some time there, because the research there last year directly led to this paper, as I'll explain in more detail later. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Nora for helping me shape this talk in preliminary conversations. Thank you so much for that. So here goes. As many of you know, the connections between periodical studies and book history run deep. When Leslie Howsam writes in Old Books and New Histories that the practitioners of book history, quote, think about the reception, the composition, the material existence, and the cultural production of what is called the book, only for lack of any better collective noun, unquote, she emphasizes that the book is not limited to the codex format and explicitly mentions periodical formats as part of the study of book culture. Ursula Rautenberg argues similarly in her definition of our discipline Buchwissenschaft, Nico said it, in Reklamsachlexikon des Buches. Nonetheless, I hope I'm not carrying owls to Athens if I posit that there is still untapped potential in the cross-section of book studies and periodical studies, and that these areas of research can fruitfully inform each other to generate a deeper understanding of textual circulation and reading cultures. The theme of this conference speaks to these potential connections directly. Keywords such as market, economies, and competition make the heart of a book studies scholar like me, who has a weakness for popular serial formats, beat faster. I hope that I will also be able to continue themes and thoughts brought to the Zoom room over the course of the week. Nora, in her brief opening words on Monday, talked about alliances between formats, and Will Slaughter gave us a broad working definition of periodicals as, quote, ongoing publications issued at regular intervals and identifiable as part of a series, unquote. That's certainly applicable to some types of book publications as well. Ruth hinted at the fascinating role of Ullstein, which book study scholars have identified as essentially the first cross-media conglomerate in German media and publishing history, and we'll talk about the significance of cross-media promotion later on. There. Some of you will perhaps know this infamous 1949 chart, Everyday Taste from Highbrow to Lowbrow. The contentious history of the term middlebrow aside, I would like to draw your attention to the grouping which I've highlighted on the right. Under the category heading Reading, we see book club selections and mass circulation magazines grouped together. This bodes well, I think, for my observations today. In this talk, I will discuss how book publishing meets periodical publishing in the realm of mass culture and within multimedia conglomerates typical of the later 20th century. In particular, we'll see where economies of scale and cross-media promotion strategies sit alongside the economies of space and time of competition and transfer highlighted in the call for papers. Quality Paperback Club, Círculo de Lectores, Bertelsmann Lesering, Book of the Month Club, Burger Lesring, France Loisier, Le Club. These names will ring a bell with anyone who has sifted through the shelves of a secondhand bookstore, cleaned up a dusty attic, spent time book hunting at a flea market, or leafed through 20th century magazines, where ads for book clubs abounded, always offering so-called loss leaders to prospective new members, offers that only paid for themselves if people actually retained their membership status beyond the first year, usually. So here you can see, send me my 4 books for $4. While the book club's ads like these fill 20th century magazines, the books they produced and distributed in the 20th century are legion. Book club editions certainly do not excite a rare book dealer. In fact, I'll show you an example later where book club editions are being sold as books by the foot for interior decorating purposes. But they're very much part and parcel, pun intended, of 20th century book and reading cultures and enmeshed within 20th century periodical culture through their ubiquity and popularity, their innate middle brownness, and that middle brownness is what has led them to be mostly overlooked by scholars. My current, and Nico hinted at this too, admittedly long-haul research project deals with what I like to call mail-order book culture. As Priya Yashi argues, novels, and I think this applies to any type of book, are different kinds of commodities. Quote, they are material products like others that are fabricated both in small batches and mass-produced, in workshops and sometimes in factories, processed, assembled, and eventually purveyed in a dizzying array of outlets and platforms, unquote. For about a century, since inception of the book clubs in the 1920s, book clubs have been one of these outlets or platforms, contributing to the mass distribution of texts, often, but not limited to novels, well beyond the reach of the traditional brick-and-mortar book trade. While the clubs all have their individual structures, the central selling points, convenience, concession on the retail price, curation, and fostering a sense of community, those were similar across a wide scope of markets and cultures. In a nutshell, book club selections were guaranteed a larger audience than trade editions, and the publisher as well as the author received sizable additional income. The book clubs also made reading material and the prospect of book ownership available to people living outside of urban centers who otherwise had limited or no access to new books. All of this, for me, plays into mail-order book culture. Simply defined, I call mail-order book culture the practices and practicalities at play when books are distributed by mail through book clubs on a subscription-based monthly or quarterly schedule, in keeping with Ted Strifus's understanding of everyday book culture from his book, The Late Age of Print. So this talk will consider mail-order book culture as adjacent or even tangential to periodical culture. Ruth's talk on Tuesday brought three terms into play: uniformity, recognizability, and familiarity. And I think all three apply to the brand that I'm focusing on today, but we'll delve into that more deeply later. First, I'd like to describe 3 points of overlap. First, and this is perhaps the most banal case, as this example shows, book clubs, themselves expert marketers, chose their advertising space wisely. Marketing budgets were spent in places where the least possible wastage, that is, the highest possible chance of actually reaching future customers, was expected. From an economic standpoint, magazine advertising was the right decision, because magazine readers already ticked several boxes for potential new book club members. They were readers. It's a pretty obvious characteristic if they're reading a magazine. They had chosen to spend resources, time, maybe even money, with a periodically published print output. They were possibly even subscribers. They had committed to spend money on a regular basis on a periodically published print output, and they were also spending money for something to read to be delivered directly to their doorstep or mailbox. So the chances of actually attaining new club members were quite good if you advertised in a magazine, and that led to advertising campaigns like this one from the Executive Book Club. But there are so many others worth looking at, and to my knowledge, nobody has looked at this cross-section yet. Clubs, which themselves were targeted toward very different groups of readers, so we've got the Executive Book Club here, think there's also the Sport Book Club, the Catholic Book Club, you name it. They would further reduce the risk of wastage of advertising funds by placing ads in the right magazines to reach their target audience. So that's the first overlap. The second is book club members' magazines. Book clubs produced their own periodicals as magalogs, which are a blend between magazines and catalogs. Last year in Mainz, at a pre-pandemic conference on transnational periodical cultures, I spoke about this widespread subproduct of mail-order book culture and framed it as custom media, which itself is another overlooked area of periodical production. The B2C, business-to-consumer, book club members magazine were published in print runs that can make your head spin and delivered to millions of doorsteps and mailboxes. For millions of readers, these magazines were the equivalent of smaller literary or cultural magazines we spend valuable research hours on. To my knowledge, though, the only larger research project that has been conducted on these magazines is Vera Dumont's work, which zooms in on the Lesering Illustrierte of the West German mega book club Bertelsmann Lesering, later Bertelsmann der Club. And while we're on the subject of Bertelsmann, I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that the success of these book clubs, like the Lesering, and its derivatives gave Bertelsmann the wherewithal to be what it is today, the world's largest multimedia conglomerate, dominating trade publishing across continents and languages, and also more than dabbling in television, radio, magazine, and other forms of media. Internet too, these days, of course. So US examples of these magazines include the Book of the Month Club News and Wings. If we were in a room together, I'd hand them around, but you can see them on the picture. And these and other book club members magazines were standard fare for middle-class readers. They blended sales and advertising with taste-making reviews and even, somewhat randomly, with depictions of art and architecture, as you can see here. Thirdly, some magazines created their own branded book clubs as a branding and marketing strategy. So forgive me for choosing this example, but an excellent example of this strategy is the Playboy Book Club, founded in 1973, here cross-marketed to the readers of Oui. Oui was the American version of the French magazine Louis, which had been purchased by Playboy Enterprises in 1972. So this was all within the family. And this is, in essence, a reciprocal branding strategy with additional layers, because as you can see, books which were also branded as Playboy books, so here you've got the Playboy's Host and Bar book, were among the books then also made available to club members. A second example is the Psychology Today book club, marketed to readers of Psychology Today in the magazine itself, but also in other competing outputs. So that's the third area of overlap, right? And I think these three areas indicate how much untapped potential there is for research, case studies, comparisons, and also reevaluations of existing research on book clubs to incorporate the periodical perspective. In order to understand these interplays of markets, publishers, book clubs, and now periodicals, I've been conducting archival research whenever and wherever possible, focusing on materials from marketing and sales departments, as well as licensing and production. While a few major book clubs are still in existence, at least as derivatives of their 20th century mass culture iterations, the availability of archival materials is limited. Corporate mergers and corporate interests have prohibited researchers from accessing book club archives. In particular, the archive of the quintessential Book of the Month Club now seems to be closed and unavailable, even though Janice Radway was granted full access and was able to conduct on-site qualitative research in the 1990s for her illuminating book, A Feeling for Books, 1997. So given the lack of access to the BOMC archives, which today are held by Bookspan and its mysterious corporate owner Pride Tree Holdings, I recently set my sights on the A.A. Knopf Inc. archives held at their Harry Ransom Center, hoping to uncover mail-order book culture basically from the other side, from the publisher perspective. So I wanted to piece together the club's workings by using the publisher correspondence. With the luck of pre-pandemic, or rather pre-lockdown timing, I was able to spend about 3 weeks in Austin last February digging through the archives of A.A. Knopf. From the finding aids, I had expected to find a good amount of documentation. Felt like striking gold, though, to see the sheer amounts of material documenting the significance of book clubs, not only the Book of the Month Club, to the publisher's bottom line. I found much that I had hoped for, with print run numbers, per copy royalties for different clubs, etc. And as archival serendipity would have it, I found even more I hadn't even thought of. And in particular, and this is what I want to discuss now in more detail, I found reams of documents relating to the Reader's Digest, the magazine, but also its subsidiary book club. Obviously, the magazine was, and still is, a mainstay of not only American periodical culture, though its influence and print circulation have admittedly waned in the past decades. As many here will know, Reader's Digest published excerpts from other publications and also from books, whether fiction or nonfiction, thus catapulting them into the wider public's eye and offering publishers and authors a lucrative additional source of income. The Reader's Digest brand is arguably one of the most recognizable and long-lasting brands in the media industry. With the magazine founded in 1922, the brand is now closing in on a century of commercial success. Like I said, it's been having difficulties. It was bought by Ripplewood in 2019, but it's still around, which is something in itself. By 1951, the Digest, so from 22 to 1951, the Digest was published in 15 languages in 48 countries with the highest circulation of any magazine in the world, 15.5 million print copies. In 1951. And as we know, the actual number of readers then have been significantly higher. Later in the century, the Digest was also published in Braille, in audio, in an accessible large type edition called Reader's Digest Large Print, and of course, now in digital as well. By 1990, Reader's Digest had a US circulation of 16.3 million copies. The numbers declined rapidly after that to 12.6 in 2000, 8.2 in 2009, and now it's around 3 million. But it's still considered a direct marketing powerhouse, and it has an incredibly wide reach. Its print and digital products reached nearly 1 in every 4 adults in the US in 2019. Given these numbers and the reach, the impact of Reader's Digest in popular culture during what David Sumner called the magazine century can hardly be overstated. Unsurprisingly, as a mass cultural output, it was, and sometimes still is, ridiculed and criticized for its, quote, conservative content, middle-class appeal, and lack of literary style. And that's Sumner. Dwight MacDonald's criticism of mass cult and mid-cult is just one instance of this type of criticism. The German philosopher Hans Magnus Enzensberger offhandedly criticized digest magazines in his text Bildung als Konsumgut, building on Adorno and Horkheimer's ideas of the culture industry and applying the principles to what he calls the apparatus of paperback publishing. And here's another overlap between paperback publishing and magazine publishing. Enzensberger notes the periodicity of paperback production with a regular monthly production cycle, and he credits exactly that periodicity with the mediocrity of the output. He also mentions the staggering print runs, the standardization of formats, and the advertising within the books themselves, emphasizing the industrialization of print culture and kind of a convergence, to use a term in a way that we don't use it anymore, but the convergence between magazine and paperback culture. In his text, Enzensberger satirically posits that digest extracts are contractually confirmed before one line of the hoped-for bestseller is written, before even one blank sheet of paper has been inserted into the typewriter. My archival research seems to indicate a different workflow. Nonetheless, bitter and pointed cultural judgments such as these from leading intellectuals of the 20th century emphasize, I think, the entangledness of periodically published mass cultural outputs within our social histories. As much as thinkers as MacDonald and Enzensberger would have liked to, they could not and did not ignore them. So beyond the extracts in Reader's Digest magazine, and more firmly located in the crossover area between periodicals and book publishing, lies the book club known as Reader's Digest Condensed Books. Reader's Digest started publishing condensed books, mostly nonfiction, in 1934 already as a feature of the magazine, which almost invariably led to a wider audience for the complete work. The company entered into book publishing then with its compilation, or anthology, The Reader's Digest Reader, followed by 3 further titles that they published with Doubleday before they created their own book publishing segment in-house. 14 Reader's Digest books were then published in 1948, selling about 600,000 copies to 10% of the magazine's subscriber base with a profit of $500,000. That was a lot of money back then, in case you're wondering. These promising developments led to the foundation of Reader's Digest Condensed Books as a book club, which would focus on entertaining trade fiction. This was, and this is Folkerts speaking, quote, a natural evolution combining the idea of a book club with Reader's Digest editorial, direct mail marketing, and recent book publishing successes, unquote. And here it is kind of through the ages, 1950, 1980, 2021. While Reader's Digest magazine has been the subject of ample scholarly scrutiny, their book publishing activities have received much less academic attention, with the exception of this older article in Publishing Research Quarterly. This lack of research belies the significant and ongoing impact of the book series on authors, publishers, and readers since 1950. Based on sheer numbers and productivity, Reader's Digest Condensed Book Club was and probably still is one of the largest publishers of hardbound books in the world. Even by the standards of mass market book clubs in the second half of the 20th century, Reader's Digest Condensed Books was a commercial giant. After its foundation in 1950, it amassed 450,000 subscribers within 1 year and 2.2 million US members by 1957. An obvious reason for the success was that Reader's Digest had already perfected the principles of mail order marketing, and they were able to effectively manage millions of missives going out and coming in on a regular basis, right? This is pre-computer. They have to figure out how to deal with all this data. Other book clubs that came kind of more from the book publishing environment had to learn how to handle big amounts of customer data. For Reader's Digest, these amounts of subscriber data were all in a day's work. In fact, synergetic effects could be easily achieved because subscribers of the magazine would also become members of the book club. The Digest was also ahead of its time regarding customer satisfaction and market research, mailing questionnaires to their subscribers to help the company design books that will meet their sale goals. In a 1985 interview in the New York Times, a Reader's Digest executive stated in a blatant display of confidence, which shows that he was clearly unfazed by competition from book publishers and other book clubs, quote, "We do 150 books a year, and we have never been wrong," unquote. Maybe this no-nonsense attitude came from the fact that there was no competition in the 1980s, at least not for these very specific, condensed, periodically published books. The book publishing activities profited from the immense subscription numbers, which offered a low-risk venture, atypical of book publishing. The economies of scale at play when the first printing was, for instance, 2.2 million copies, made the per-copy costs incredibly low. And at this point in the 1980s, the Reader's Digest was the leading print magazine in the US with a market share of about 6% based on total circulation. And with its book publishing activities at this point, it alone was responsible for 2.1% of the US book industry's revenue. For comparison, at the time, Random House was responsible for 4.9% and Simon & Schuster for 6.3%. So this was not a side hustle. This was, big business. If we think about economies of transfer, the Reader's Digest condensed book series was a successful transnational phenomenon, just like the magazine, profiting from publishing contacts around the globe. Reader's Digest condensed books were available in 13 countries, with English versions published in UK, South Africa, and Australia from 1954 onwards, as well as several foreign language editions, particularly in Europe and in countries where European languages were spoken, like in Brazil. The brand and its mass distribution of books continue today under the name of Reader's Digest Select Editions. In Germany, for instance, the brand is called Reader's Digest Das Beste, and while the operations were sold to the Spanish direct marketing firm CIL, the brand is still very much marketed as belonging to the Reader's Digest, as you can see here. The central idea of the club was, and still is today, as you can see, to offer 3 to 6, usually 4 texts combined into one thick, hardbound volume with a bourgeois sheen. You can also see this is what it looked like in the 50s, and this is what it looks like today. So it's still very, very similar, the look, the uniformity, right, that Ruth was talking about. In order to fit these texts into one volume, the editors condensed the original work into a shorter version. Of course, abridgment has a long and complex tradition, including bowdlerization and epitomization practices, raising interesting questions about copyright and censorship, which can be productively analyzed through the lens of book history and print culture studies. For our purposes, though, we can limit ourselves to the brief definition of condensation undertaken by Reader's Digest for these condensed books. And Volkretz defines this as, quote, an extended hierarchical editorial process of abridging and summarizing text by retaining both style and substance, known as cutting, omitting quotation marks from verbatim passages, replacing deletions with transitions made in the manner of the author, and toning down or excising excessive violence and explicit sex scenes without changing vocabulary other than inserting dashes following the first letter of a profanity, unquote. Overtly political content was sometimes toned down as well to appeal to a broad base of middle-class readers. Texts by a surprisingly large range of authors were condensed, spanning genres and forms, from Nobel Prize winners to more popular authors. In the 50s and 60s, for instance, texts by Conrad Richter, William Faulkner, Pearl S. Buck, and John Steinbeck were edited for publication in the condensed books, alongside texts by many other contemporary authors who have not made their way into the canon. Elsewhere, I've argued that the reasons for readers to join book sales clubs can be circumscribed in a 4C model: convenience, concession, community, and perhaps most importantly, curation. And within this model, condensation serves as a particular curational practice, targeting a very certain group of readers. The original advertising leaflet for Reader's Digest condensed books sent out to 200,000 Reader's Digest subscribers emphasized these perks to potential charter subscribers, and they also sent this to the Knopfs, which is why I found it. Quote, all who enjoy good books wish they had more time for reading. We can all relate to that, I think, because they realize how many of the very best books they are missing. Now, condensation provides a delightful time-saving means of at least doubling the number of books one can enjoy, unquote. So the leaflet gave some more detail on the skillful condensations, bringing you the full story power, flavor, and climactic experience of a novel. Their language, not mine. Unsurprisingly, cultural critics, already wary of book clubs and their commodification of book culture, ridiculed this practice of condensation. In The Nation, David Court derided the club, explaining why he felt it was even more problematic than regular book clubs. He says, Reader's Digest Condensed Book Club simplifies the battle for the reader's mind to its essence. Court went on to call the book club editions evaporated books, and he compared a condensation line to line before coming to the conclusion, quote, wherever the author assumes any intelligence on the reader's part, the editors paint signposts all over the place, unquote. So what happened was that Reader's Digest condensed books secured the condensation rights from original publishers and then held the copyright to their own condensation, which could then be repurposed, translated, and republished under the Reader's Digest brand. In case of further use, such as translation and publication in a foreign Reader's Digest condensed books edition, either a fixed honorarium was offered or a per-copy royalty was agreed upon. So in the 50s, the fixed honorarium would have only been about $200. And we'll talk a little bit about the royalties later. The club was undeniably an economic success and also undeniably an important access point for a wide variety of readers seeking information, entertainment, and pleasure between the covers of a hardbound book. For publishers, the condensations led to additional rights income, which was welcomed and split with the authors. So at AA Knopf, they had one person, William Koshland, during kind of the 50s to the 70s, who was responsible for all the book clubs. But this kept one person in full-time work, right? Just communicating and doing all the licensing deals with the book clubs. So Lynette Owens says that the additional opportunities afforded by exploiting various aspects of the intellectual property in a work include a wide range of possible licensing, which can provide significant additional income for authors, literary agents, and publishers, as well as bringing the work to a wider audience in a variety of forms, unquote. So publishers who had worked with Reader's Digest at a magazine were used to the ample royalties for publication of excerpts and quotations, and they generally hoped that the visibility in Reader's Digest might boost the book sales. The same principle applied to the condensed book editions, as my recent archival research has suggested. To compare and substantiate, because I only had A.A. Knopf at the HRC, I also went to Mainzer Verlagsarchiv to look at the correspondence between the large German trade publisher Rowohlt Verlag and the German Reader's Digest condensed books Das Beste. It seems that publishers like Rowohlt and Knopf were convinced that the condensed books formed a very different market segment and reached very different readers than both their hardcover editions and any paperback editions. Certainly, and there's ample archival evidence to this effect, they said that the publication of a text in the condensed edition would not cannibalize traditional sales through brick-and-mortar book sales. From a purely financial standpoint, then, condensation was a very attractive additional revenue stream. In 1952, the option to publish a 12,000-word condensation of a title that A.A. Knopf held the digest rights to would have meant $2,500 option fee upfront for US and Canadian editions. An additional $3,500 would be paid if the option was exercised, plus a separate payment of $1,500 for foreign digest rights to be paid to the foreign rights holders through an agent. So in total, the condensation would have generated at least $7,500 in additional revenue. And for comparison, the Nobel Prize at the time was $36,000. So that's, $1 million today, right? So the only condition for all of this additional revenue was that the Reader's Digest wanted to make sure that no other serial or condensation rights were granted to any other publication for a period of 18 months, and that the agreement would only come to fruition if Reader's Digest could secure world condensation rights. So you have that connection with the transfer there immediately, right? They really want to make sure that they don't just have the content for the US and Canadian editions, but for the worldwide editions. Additional distribution above and beyond the expected circulation numbers could lead to further royalty payments, usually at about 3 or 4 cents per copy, and this was in the 50s. Again, that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're talking about 800,000 copies, it adds up. Even in the first half of the 50s, so right after the club was founded, individual volumes could easily sell over 1 million copies, and sometimes significantly more. So William Koshland, who again was responsible for book club rights, wrote to Reader's Digest condensed books in what can only be described as an understatement, quote, "Your expected sale of more than 1 million copies is gratifying," unquote. Later in the decade, so in the 50s, when Reader's Digest condensed books had amassed more subscribers, the anticipated average sale rose to 2.5 million copies, translating into an impressive $45,000 check for the condensation of one novel. In this case, the check that I found was for Conrad Richter's The Lady. Understandably, however, authors may have found themselves in a conflicted role vis-a-vis the condensation club. Having their works condensed and distributed may have been an economic windfall, but called authorial integrity and literary aesthetics into question. This summer, I have an article coming out about the American author and Pulitzer Prize winner John Hersey, who was very critical of the book clubs, but he also recognized that they were an economic boon, which he, as a family father, could not say no to. He was strictly opposed to condensation, and given his cultural cachet at the time, he managed to resist the condensation and was able to achieve publication in full of his short book, A Single Pebble, though some minor textual changes were made with his consent. And you can see on the right the notes of William Koshland noting down which textual changes are going to be made. And I've compared that copy to copy. And so what you see here is the outside of the US edition and the wrapper of the British edition, which appeared in the same year. As with many other similar book clubs in the second half of the 20th century, the Reader's Digest condensed books were marketed through emphasis of their material form and their status as symbols of culture. So this is very different than periodical publishing, right? This is a major difference there. In the 1963 ad in Life magazine, the club highlighted the fact that that members received, quote, 4 bestsellers in one luxuriously bound 504-page volume. According to the ad, membership also enabled readers to build an impressive matching library of deluxe illustrated volumes. And you can see what the library looks like on the right. And this is the books by the foot that you can now buy for $29.99 from the interior decorators. In a nod toward the alleged collectability of the volumes, they contained a blank book plate on the front right-hand end paper, as you can see here. And multiple ads in the 50s described the books as deluxe with a heavy backbone, gold stamps, and they said these beautiful matched volumes will form an impressive library you'll be proud to display in your home. Anecdotally, Alfred Knopf once complimented Reader's Digest on, quote, knowing how to turn out a charming looking book, unquote. In this case, this was the 1959 July volume. Charming, though, sounds a bit patronizing, doesn't it? This brings us full circle, I think, to Ruth's 3 characteristics of uniformity, recognizability, and familiarity. Reader's Digest condensed books were all of those to a T. Where does this leave us then regarding mail order book culture and periodicity, subscription, and mass circulation? Are these books periodicals? Despite Will's definition and Ruth's characteristics, I would say no, strictly speaking, they're not, but they are arguably adjacent to periodicals and were created with readers of periodicals in mind as an ideal target audience to market towards and to glean new readers from. So Reader's Digest condensed books were published periodically on a quarterly basis, produced within strictly defined parameters, which allowed for impressive economies of scale, and sold via subscription to a subscriber base managed by a highly professional and efficient data management system, which had been perfected by the most successful magazine publisher of the 20th century. Serendipitously, my recent archival research with a book studies focus, oriented toward marketing, sales, production, and licensing within the book publisher's archive, has led me to see connections between periodical culture and book culture, which I had not seen before, and which I believe merit further study. Certainly, by sheer numbers, the audiences reached through crossover ventures between magazine and book publishing were vast, and the impact substantial on a national and transnational level. If our goal is to understand reading cultures and the mass circulation of text-based media in the 20th century more fully, it seems fruitful, necessary even, to focus on the common ground between mass periodical culture and mass market book culture. In the meantime, though, as we head into the summer reading mode, maybe an old volume of condensed books will suit for beach reading. You don't have to become a member. Given the millions of copies in circulation, you shouldn't have trouble finding one in a little free library near you. And if you feel you've already done ample reading this year, how about some official Reader's Digest condensed books crafting instead? In any case, happy condensed reading or crafting, and thank you.